Realism and Truth by Michael Devitt. Chapter 3, What is Truth? Chapter 3.1, Introduction. The question, what is truth, might be taken to be a question about our ordinary notion of truth. Or if, as seems likely, there are several such notions, the question might be taken in the present context to be about one of those notions, the semantic notion. But what is the interest of this ordinary notion? Why should we bother with it? We should bother with it only if the notion plays a role in our best theory of the world. To say that a notion is ordinary is just to say that it occurs in folk theory. Clearly enough, not all the notions of folk theory deserve a place on our best theory. In Chapter 6, I shall argue that the ordinary semantic notion of truth is one that does. In this chapter, I shall simply assume that we need this notion of truth and will begin to explain it. The explanation will continue in Chapter 6. In my view, the ordinary semantic notion of truth is correspondence notion. Other notions of truth have been proposed. I take it that a minimum requirement for something being a notion of truth is that the equivalence thesis holds for it, such each instance of schema T. S is true if and only if P, obtained by substaining or substituting for P a sentence which a translation of the sentence referred to by the term substituted for S, must come out true. This thesis is the basis for Tarski's famous convention T. If the equivalence thesis does not hold for a notion, there seems no good reason for calling it truth. Of course, if I am right in thinking this ordinary notion is a correspondence one, then it is arguable to say that any other notion of truth is not, even if the equivalence thesis does not hold for it. In this case, it is the correspondence notion that I shall be concerned with. I shall consider other possible notions only to the extent that doing so helps clarify the correspondence notion. I shall not assume realism here. The application of correspondence notion of truth requires the existence of some form of objective reality, but it need not be the form required by realism. In the next chapter, I shall discuss the relationship between realism and truth. Chapter 3.2, the classical correspondence notion. The basic idea of correspondence notion of truth is familiar. A sentence is true if and only if it corresponds to the facts, or to reality. It is plausible to see signs of this in Aristotle. Quote, to say of what is that it is not, or of what it is not that it is false, while to say of what is that is, or what is not that is true. End quote. However, it would be more cautious of this to see this as simply an expression of the equivalence thesis. Classical attempts to explain the correspondence notion of truth quickly ran into insurmountable difficulties. If truth holds of a sentence in virtue of its corresponding to a fact, then we need an explanation of this correspondence and of these facts. Attempts to explain correspondence sank quickly into metaphors. Sentences, quote, mirrored, end quote, or, quote, pictured, end quote, facts. And facts were mysterious entities with uncertain identity conditions. They were particularly repugnant to those with a taste for desert landscapes. Some correspondence theorists treated a further problem. They had it that it was not sentences, but the, quote, propositions, end quote, that sentences express, which were the truth bearers of the truth values. This introduced another mysterious entity to be explained. Despite these difficulties, we can abstract from these classical discussions the following features of the correspondence notion of truth. 1. It holds of a sentence or proposition, I shall overlook this alternative in the future, partly in virtue of the objective structure of the sentence. 2. It holds of a sentence partly in virtue of the objective relation the sentence has to reality. 3. It holds of a sentence partly in virtue of the objective nature of reality. Structure, relation, and reality are objective in being, the way they are or whatever, despite anyone's opinion. 2.2. These features particularly. 3. Capture the traditional views of the correspondence theorists that a sentence is made true by independent reality. Chapter 3.3. A contemporary correspondence notion. Consider a true sentence with a very simple structure. The predication A is F. This sentence is true in virtue of the fact that there exists an object which A designates and which is among the objects F applies to. So this sentence is true because it has a predicational structure containing words standing in certain referential relations to parts of reality, and because of the way that reality is. Provided structure, relations, and reality are objective, then the sentence's correspondence is true. Its truth has all the features we have just abstracted from classical discussions. Yet this truth does not require any of the mysterious entities and relations of those discussions. The only entities we need are the familiar ones we already have. objects of one sort or another, and the other only relations we need are the ones in reference to the parts of the sentence and the objects. If we could generalize this approach to cover the many structures of natural language and explain the appropriate reference relations, then we would be well on the way to at least explaining the correspondence notion of truth. The first major step in making generalization possible was made by Alfred Tarski in the, quote, The Concept of Truth in Formalized Languages, end quote. He showed how to explain truth in terms of reference for various formal languages containing sentences with structures of central importance to natural languages. Truth functional, predicational, qualitative structures, quantificational structures, He was pessimistic about extending his approach to natural languages because of their complexity and semantic paradoxes. Donald Davidson in 1967 was the first to take an optimistic view of these difficulties. He pointed out the importance of work in modern linguistics in reducing the complexities of natural language to structures more open to Tarski's approach. Should we be able to explain truth in terms of reference along these lines, it would still remain to explain reference. The hope here is for causal theories of reference along the lines first suggested by Saul Kriepke in 1972, Keith Donnellan in 1972, and Hilary Putnam in 1975. In my view, in 1981, the prospects for such theories are promising. All in all, then, I think we are on the way to explaining a notion of truth with all the features we abstracted from the classical discussions of correspondence notion. Bringing the features together, we can state the doctrine of correspondence notion of truth applies to sentences of certain type, the doctrine correspondence truth X, as follows. Sentences of type X are true or false in virtue of 1. Their objective structure, 2. The objective referential relations between their parts in reality, and 3. The objective nature of that reality. The need to make the doctrine relative to a type of sentence is clear once it is realized that correspondence truth can hold for some sentences and not others. Thus it is common to subscribe to correspondence truth physical, whilst rejecting the correspondence truth ethical. Where the context makes it obvious that sentences of type X are under discussion, I shall often abbreviate correspondence truth X to correspondence truth. Some might call correspondence truth semantic realism, but I shall not do so far as convenient. I intend to use the term realism only for entirely non-semantical doctrines. This should help to avoid many of the confusions in the current debate about realism. Tarski, Davidson, and Putnam also think we are on the way to explaining a correspondence notion of truth. However, their views of their own contributions to that explanation differ from mine. My view draws on Hartley Field's criticism in 1972 of Tarski's list-like definitions of reference. Field argues that these are inadequate, and that Tarski's theory needs to be supplemented by theories of reference. Davidson in 1977 and Putnam in 1978 have since argued that Tarski's definitions are significant for our purposes. Further, Putnam does not see his work on causal theories of reference as being a theory of reference in the sense Field requires. I shall say nothing on the latter point here. To prepare for a discussion on the former point, we need to distinguish my correspondence notion of truth from my disquotational or redundancy notion. With this distinction, the difficulties our theorizing about truth begin to appear. Chapter 3.4, the disquotational notion. The equivalence thesis holds for a correspondence notion of truth as for any other. The appropriate instances of S is true if and only if P come out to true. Suppose this were all there were to truth. There would be no more to truth than its role as a disquotation device. The sentence formed by placing S between quotation marks and following it by is true is synonymous with S. This anemic notion of truth is disquotational truth. Truth as a mere disquotation device is the basic idea of this redundancy view of truth made famous by F.P. Ramsey in his paper, quote, Facts and Propositions, end quote, in 1931. Grover, Camp, and Belknap have offered a sophisticated development of Ramsey's approach, claiming that true should be seen as redundant only in the sense that logical words like or are redundant, if it is ascriptively redundant, but nonetheless useful. Leeds has also brought out how useful the disquotational notion is for certain purposes. What is striking about all these uses of true is that they do not make truth explanatory. It is not playing an essential role in the causal explanation of behavior of an entity. Rather, in these In these uses, true is simply a device for talking about non-linguistic reality while appearing to talk about sentences. I shall take it as definitive of the disquotational notion of truth that it is not explanatory. It is reasonable to expect that the purposes of the disquotational notion, indicated by Grover, Camp, Belknap, and Leeds, would also be served by an explanatory notion of truth. However, a notion that goes beyond those proposes to explain something in nature is not, in my terminology, disquotational. A presupposition of my discussion of correspondence truth has been that truth is explanatory. I shall argue for this presupposition in Chapter 6. If truth is explanatory, it stands in need of an explanation itself. So my talk in correspondence truth X of sentences being true or false, partly in virtue of the objective referential relations of their parts in reality, must be taken strictly. Reference relations in nature explain a sentence's truth or falsity. Disquotational truth is non-explanatory and does not need to be explained in terms of reference. One way of putting Field's point is what Tarski defined as a disquotational notion. The appeal to reference in the definition is not explanatory but a mere device. It is made necessary by the fact that disquotational truths, for the languages Tarski is concerned with, requires an infinite number of instances of schema T. Take any large set of objects and any set of names with the same cardinality. There will be many different one-to-one relations between the two sets. Each of these could be part of what Leeds calls a reference scheme, which can be used to define a truth scheme. For the language containing the names, in the absence of further information, we have no reason to choose one such reference scheme as reference, and hence no reason to choose one such truth scheme as truth. Suppose now that the only constraint on choice of a reference scheme is that the equivalence thesis holds for the resulting truth scheme. Even if only one reference scheme met that constraint, that would not show that there has any explanatory significance to that scheme. In fact, has often been pointed out, many different reference schemes will meet the constraint. One such scheme is, of course, the natural one to choose. It includes a one-to-one relation that assigns France to France, Germany to Germany, and so on. This choice is natural because of our ordinary use of words like designate or refer. This use is such that each instance of N designates A, obtained by substituting for A name which is a translation of the name by the term substituted for M, must come out to be true. However, this fact about the ordinary use of designate does not help to show that the one-to-one relation it picks out is of greater significance than any other. It does not show that the one-to-one relation we call designation is the important relation between names and objects, that it plays a distinguished role in our traffic with the world. There is nothing to show that is genuinely explanatory relation in nature. The Tarski definition of designation is constructed out of the list established by the above natural correspondence. N designates A equals DF. A is France and N is France, or A is Germany and N is Germany. If designation were not an explanatory relation, and truth were only disquotational, then this trivial definition would suffice, for such definitions make talk of reference eliminable. It is an instrument, a mere manner of speaking to be dropped when the chips are down. The disquotational notion of truth might be called a correspondence notion, for each instance of schema T places a sentence in a relation to a fact. However, this is an uninteresting correspondence because the sentence is just as much related to indefinitely many other facts. Thus, each truth scheme for English assignment of a fact to the sentence snow is white. One scheme assigns snow is white, another grass is green, another blood is red, and so on. On the disquotational view of truth, there is nothing special about the relation between words and the words set up by a truth scheme, what we call truth. For this reason, I do not think the disquotational notion merits the term correspondence. However, my main point is that the notion is different from the one I call correspondence. For my notion, see the truth as special, and it has an explanatory role to be discussed in Chapter 6. Davidson not only sees his notion of truth as a correspondence one, but also gives it a central role in his explanation of people and their language. If it is explanatory, then anyone who is physicalistically or even scientifically inclined should think that it needs an explanation itself. Yet Davidson denies the need for an explanation in terms of reference and offers no other explanation. I shall criticize his position in Chapter 10. Putnam has recently sided with Davidson against Field on the issue of reference. I have argued somewhere else that he has given no good reason for doing so. Chapter 3.5 Epistemic Notions. It follows from my explanation of correspondence truth that the notion is in no way epistemic. In this, it differs from notions like warranted, assertability, verifiable, knowable, and rationally acceptable in the ideal limit of the on-rising. Some philosophers have wanted to identify truth with some sort of epistemic notion. For the identification to have any sort support, it is necessary, in my view, that the equivalence thesis holds for the notion. If the notion does not satisfy this minimum requirement, then a more appropriate description of what the philosophers want would be the elimination of truth. However, this issue of elimination versus identification is besides my main point. I claim that truth is neither to be identified with nor to be eliminated in favor of any epistemic notion. Truth is one thing, evidence for it is quite another. Despite this, a supporter of correspondence truth need not be committed to the strong thesis that a sentence might be false, even though all possible evidence counted for its truth. He should regard this thesis as an epistemic one, logically distinct from his view of truth, to be settled in the light of his epistemology and the interpretation of possible evidence. The problem of interpretation concerns the constraints, if any, on what counts as possible evidence. Clearly, possible evidence covers more than the evidence so far actually gathered. But how much more? For us, who's doing the further gathering? The perfect observer? God? The ideal human observer? Good sense organs, Tarrantine education and science? When awake, sober, etc.? The average human observer when awake, sober, etc.? Second, whoever he is, where is he doing the observing? Anywhere that he might have been, in what sense? Logically possibly, empirically possibly, or technically possibly? In its early days, the earth was too hot for humans. Later, when it was not so hot, we had not yet evolved. Until recently, it was not technically possible to make certain observations of Saturn. Third, are the observations with the naked eye or instrument assisted? Fourth, if the latter, what instruments can do the assisting? Those actually invented by humans at one point? Those actually invented by humans in the long run? Those that might have been invented by humans? Those that might have been invented by anything? Fifth, does the observer know only what actually goes on or what might have gone on? Sixth, if the latter, in what ways may the observer interfere with the nature? What experiments can be performed which were not performed? Those that were invented at one point? Those that were invented in the long run? Those that might have been invented? Using what instruments? And so on. The vagueness in the notion of possible evidence indicated by this brief discussion carries over to such other modal epistemic notions as verifiable and knowable. Before a correspondence theorist should commit himself to any view on the relation between truth and one of these epistemic notions, he needs to have this vagueness removed. With it removed, he can then apply his epistemology to the yielded view. I return to this issue in section 4.2. and when considering Putnam's ideal theory in section 11.3. In sum, I hold to correspondence truth is to believe in a notion of truth that is not explained in terms of evidence. Questions of evidence are epistemic ones, quite distinct from the constitutive question of the nature of truth. Nevertheless, it may be that given a liberal enough interpretation of possible evidence, the correspondence theorist would agree that a sentence that fit all possible evidence could not be false. End of chapter 3.